Evelyn Vance had barely taken a seat in the back row of Courtroom 302 when Judge William Sterling decided to make an example of her. He did not know that the quiet black woman sitting in the worn oak pews was the newly appointed Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court. He only saw a citizen he believed had no power, someone who had dared to cross his line of sight without flinching. For 20 years, Sterling had ruled his courtroom like a petty king. He wielded his gavel not as an instrument of justice, but as a weapon of intimidation, confident that his rulings were absolute, his transcripts untouchable, and his authority unquestionable. The morning docket was full of eviction notices and minor infractions, the kind of cases that disproportionately affected the poor and marginalized. Evelyn had intentionally arrived in plain, unassuming clothes, carrying only a simple leather notebook. She had requested her swearing-in ceremony be delayed by 1 week so she could conduct a secret, unannounced tour of the district courts. She wanted to enter through the public doors and see exactly how the justice system treated people when it thought nobody important was watching. What she found in Sterling's courtroom was a suffocating atmosphere of fear. At the defense table stood a young, trembling mother facing an eviction she could not afford to fight. The woman was desperately trying to explain that her landlord had illegally locked her out and disposed of her belongings. But Judge Sterling slammed his gavel, his face flushed with irritation. "I do not care about your excuses," Sterling barked, his voice echoing sharply off the high ceilings. "The law is the law, and in this room, I am the law. You have 5 days to vacate the premises." From the back row, Evelyn spoke. She did not shout, she did not raise her hand, but her voice carried a clear, undeniable authority that cut through the heavy air. "Your Honor, under Section 402 of the Tenant Protection Act, an illegal lockout requires an immediate, mandatory stay of eviction until a full investigation is conducted." The courtroom went dead silent. The bailiff stiffened near the door. The court reporter stopped typing, her fingers hovering over the keys. Up on the bench, Judge Sterling slowly turned his gaze toward the back of the room. His eyes narrowed, scanning Evelyn with blatant contempt. He saw a black woman in a simple gray cardigan, challenging his legal knowledge in front of his entire court. He scoffed, leaning aggressively over his heavy mahogany desk. "Who let you in here?" Sterling demanded, his voice dripping with venom. "Bailiff, remove this woman immediately. If she speaks another word, throw her in a holding cell for contempt of court. I will not have my courtroom disrespected by people who do not know their place." Evelyn remained perfectly still. She did not shrink back, nor did she break eye contact. She let the silence stretch, locking eyes with the man whose career she was about to systematically dismantle. She stood up slowly, picking up her leather notebook. She had seen enough. The trap was set, and Sterling had just walked willingly into it. She stood up slowly, picking up her leather notebook. The bailiff, a burly man named Harris, who had spent a decade enforcing Sterling's moods rather than the law, took a heavy step toward her. His hand rested intimidatingly on his utility belt. Evelyn did not wait for him to close the distance. She turned and walked toward the heavy double doors, her footsteps steady and unhurried against the scuffed hardwood floor. She did not look back, but her ears caught the collective exhale of the terrified courtroom and the sharp, satisfied crack of Judge Sterling's gavel resuming its tyrannical rhythm. He had dismissed her as a mere annoyance, a powerless nobody who had temporarily disrupted his kingdom. He believed he had won. Outside in the echoing marble hallway, Evelyn did not leave the courthouse. She found a quiet wooden bench near the clerk's office, opened her notebook, and began to write with meticulous precision. Anger was useless. This was about chronology and undeniable evidence. She documented the exact time of the incident, the precise phrasing of Sterling's unlawful eviction order, his threat of illegal detainment, and the specific positions of the court staff who had stood by in silent complicity. The court reporter who stopped typing, the bailiff who moved to intimidate, the clerk who stared at the floor, all of them had been trained by Sterling's temper to look away. They were complicit cogs in a machine designed to crush the vulnerable. Evelyn knew that simply removing one arrogant judge would not fix the district court. The rot was deep and systemic. Sterling was merely a symptom of a judicial culture that had learned to prioritize blind compliance over justice and administrative speed over due process. She pulled out her phone and sent a brief, encrypted message to the lead investigator of the State Judicial Conduct Commission. The preliminary assessment is complete. Begin drafting preservation orders immediately for all Courtroom 302 transcripts and audio logs. Back inside, Sterling was holding court in his private chambers during the morning recess. He poured himself a cup of black coffee, chuckling with Harris about the arrogant woman who thought she could quote the law in his domain. He believed the incident was already erased from the universe, just another undocumented moment of his absolute supremacy. He had no idea that the trap had just snapped shut. While Judge Sterling enjoyed his recess, Evelyn Vance did not remain idle. She walked straight into the district court's records room, stepping past the line of frustrated citizens. When the head archivist moved to scold her, Evelyn quietly presented a specialized identification card. The elderly clerk's eyes widened in sheer panic as he recognized the gold seal of the state Supreme Court and the name of the newly appointed Chief Justice. Evelyn placed a single finger to her lips, signaling absolute silence. I need the sealed transcripts and audio recordings for every eviction and contempt charge Judge William Sterling has presided over in the last 6 months, she instructed softly, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. And I need them printed and brought to the private annex in the next hour. Do not inform his chambers. The archivist scrambled to comply, his hands shaking as he bypassed the standard bureaucratic delays that usually stalled public requests for weeks. Within 45 minutes, Evelyn sat alone in a dimly lit annex room, surrounded by towering stacks of legal documents and court logs. As she read through the pages, her initial anger hardened into cold, calculated resolve. Sterling's courtroom was not just a place of personal arrogance. It was a factory of systematic abuse. He routinely denied public defenders the right to speak, issued maximum fines for minor infractions to impoverished defendants, and disproportionately targeted minorities with contempt charges whenever they dared to ask clarifying questions about their rights. He had built a tyrannical fiefdom on the backs of people who lacked the financial resources to appeal his decisions. The incident in the lobby was not an anomaly. It was his standard operating procedure. Evelyn carefully highlighted key passages, cross-referencing his rulings with the State Code of Judicial Conduct. She was not just building a case for a minor reprimand or a temporary suspension, she was constructing an airtight dossier for his immediate removal from the bench and the permanent revocation of his legal license. Every illegal ruling was a nail in his professional coffin. Meanwhile, back in Courtroom 302, Sterling resumed the bench, entirely oblivious to the storm gathering just a few corridors away. He slammed his gavel, ordering the next terrified defendant to step forward. Feeling invincible, surrounded by his loyal bailiff and a silent, compliant staff. He did not notice the 2 sharp-suited investigators from the Judicial Conduct Commission slipping quietly into the back row, taking the exact seats Evelyn had occupied just an hour prior. They watched, recorded, and waited. Evelyn closed the final transcript folder. The evidence was irrefutable. She took out her phone and sent a final encrypted message to the mayor and the head of the State Bar Association, both of whom she had invited to her upcoming swearing-in ceremony. Change of plans, she wrote. We are moving the official ceremony to District Courtroom 302, tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock a.m. She packed her leather notebook, preparing to deliver a public reckoning that Sterling and his complicit staff would never forget. The following morning at 8:45 a.m., District Courtroom 302 was unusually crowded. Judge William Sterling sat in his private chambers, adjusting his black robe and admiring his reflection in the heavy mirror. He anticipated a routine docket of evictions, small claims, and easy dismissals. Out in the hallway, however, the atmosphere was shifting rapidly. Instead of the usual line of terrified tenants and exhausted public defenders, the corridor was filling with high-ranking city officials, senior partners from prestigious law firms, and several prominent local journalists. Bailiff Harris paced nervously near the double doors, unsure of how to manage the sudden influx of tailored suits and flashing cameras. When Mayor Patricia Coleman and the president of the State Bar Association walked through the doors and took their seats in the front row, Harris practically sprinted to the judge's chambers. Sterling pushed through his chamber doors just before 9 o'clock a.m., his face flushed with irritation at the unannounced disruption of his schedule. He stepped up to the bench, raising his gavel to demand order, but the words died in his throat. The gallery was packed with the most powerful legal minds in the state. He looked toward the mayor, attempting a confused but polite smile. "Mayor Coleman, this is a surprise. To what do we owe the honor?" he asked, his voice completely lacking its usual thunderous authority. Mayor Coleman did not smile back. She simply nodded toward the rear of the courtroom. The heavy wooden doors opened. The low murmur of the crowd vanished instantly. Every person in the gallery stood up in a unified display of absolute respect. Walking down the center aisle was Evelyn Vance. She was no longer wearing the simple gray cardigan from the day before. Today, she wore the heavy, immaculate black robes of the Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court. The gold judicial medallion rested squarely on her chest, Sterling's face drained of all color. His hand trembled so violently that the gavel slipped from his grip, clattering loudly against the solid mahogany wood. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the perfectly silent room. He recognized her immediately. It was the woman he had threatened to throw in a holding cell. The woman he had mocked, humiliated, and ordered removed for daring to quote the law in his presence. Evelyn walked with a slow, deliberate cadence. Her eyes locked onto Sterling with a gaze so cold it seemed to freeze the air in the room. She bypassed the gallery, walked past the defense tables, and stopped directly at the foot of his bench. Sterling's breath grew shallow. He tried to speak, to offer some stammering apology or excuse, but his throat had completely closed. Evelyn looked up at him, her voice perfectly calm and devastatingly clear. "Good morning, William. I believe you are sitting in my chair." Judge William Sterling stared down from the bench, his mind desperately struggling to process the impossible reality standing before him. The woman he had threatened, mocked, and attempted to throw in a holding cell just 24 hours ago was now wearing the immaculate black robes and gold medallion of the Chief Justice. The silence in Courtroom 302 was absolute, heavy with the suffocating weight of impending consequences. Mayor Coleman, sitting in the front row, did not offer a comforting glance. The president of the State Bar Association watched with clinical, unforgiving detachment. "Chief Justice Vance?" Sterling finally stammered. His voice cracked, entirely devoid of the booming, tyrannical arrogance that usually dominated the room. He gripped the edge of his mahogany desk to steady his trembling hands. I was not informed of this change in schedule or your appointment." "I am aware, William," Evelyn replied, her tone perfectly even, slicing through the tension like a scalpel. She stepped around the defense table and slowly approached the stairs leading to the bench. "I did not want you informed. I wanted to see this courtroom exactly as it operates when you believe the doors are closed to accountability and you are untouchable." She ascended the steps. Sterling instinctively stood up, stumbling slightly as he backed away from the high-backed leather chair he had occupied for 2 decades. Evelyn did not sit. She turned to face the gallery, her eyes sweeping over the terrified court staff, the bewildered bailiff, and the high-ranking officials who had come to witness the reckoning. "The foundation of our justice system is not fear," Evelyn addressed the room, her voice projecting effortlessly, carrying the full weight of her office. "It is fairness. When a judge uses this bench as a throne to bully the vulnerable, he does not just fail the citizens, he poisons the entire institution of law." She turned her piercing gaze back to Sterling, who looked as though all the blood had been drained from his body. She reached into her robe and produced the simple black leather notebook she had carried the day before, setting it deliberately on the desk between them. "Yesterday, you ordered an illegal eviction against a mother who had no representation," Evelyn stated, her words sharp and methodical. "You threatened a citizen with unlawful detainment for daring to cite the law in your presence. And, as the archives proved last night, this was not an anomaly. It is your standard operating procedure." Sterling's eyes darted toward the exit, seeking an escape, but the path was already blocked. Two stern investigators from the Judicial Conduct Commission had quietly moved to the front of the aisle, their badges visible. Bailiff Harris, realizing the immediate shift in power, lowered his head and took a step away from the bench, abandoning the judge he had protected for years. I was only trying to maintain order," Sterling whispered frantically, his excuses sounding hollow and pathetic in the grand room. "The docket is overloaded. These people, they do not understand the process." "Order is not tyranny, and you do not understand the law," Evelyn interrupted coldly. "Effective immediately, you are suspended from all judicial duties pending a full ethical review. You will surrender your gavel, your access badges, and your pride. The law you claim to be has finally come for you." Sterling stood frozen, the reality of his total ruin crashing down upon him. The man who had spent 2 decades destroying lives with the casual flick of his wrist now found himself entirely paralyzed by the very system he had abused. He looked toward Bailiff Harris, silently pleading for the kind of physical intervention Harris had always provided against unruly citizens. But Harris kept his eyes fixed firmly on the polished wooden floor, stepping even further away. Power in Courtroom 302 had shifted instantly, and the loyalty of men like Harris always followed the crown, not the king. The 2 investigators from the Judicial Conduct Commission ascended the steps to the bench. They did not treat Sterling with the deference he felt he was owed. "Your access cards, William," one investigator said, his voice stripped of any professional courtesy. "And the robes. You are no longer authorized to wear them in this building." Sterling's hands shook as he fumbled with the zipper of his black robe. He pulled it off, the heavy fabric pooling on the chair he would never sit in again. Underneath, he wore a wrinkled dress shirt, suddenly looking small, ordinary, and incredibly fragile. As the investigators escorted him down the steps and up the center aisle, the silence in the gallery was deafening. The senior law partners watched with grim satisfaction. The public defenders exchanged looks of stunned disbelief. The tyrant was being marched out of his own castle, head bowed, stripped of his armor and his authority. Evelyn did not watch him leave. Her focus remained entirely on the institution she had sworn to protect. She turned her attention to the terrified court clerk, whose hands were still trembling over her keyboard. "Call the defense attorney for the eviction case heard yesterday morning at 9 o'clock, Evelyn instructed, her voice projecting calm, restorative authority. "Inform them that the eviction order has been vacated immediately, and a full investigation into the landlord's illegal lockout is underway." The clerk nodded frantically, typing the command with a renewed, almost desperate urgency. Mayor Patricia Coleman stood up in the front row, a slow, appreciative smile spreading across her face. The president of the State Bar Association leaned over and whispered, "I believe the district courts are finally in capable hands." Evelyn then turned to face the gallery, looking directly at the lawyers, the staff, and the citizens who had come expecting another day of dread. "Justice is not a weapon," she proclaimed, her words echoing clearly through the high ceilings of the courtroom. "It is a shield, and from this day forward, any officer of the court who forgets the difference will find themselves standing exactly where Mr. Sterling just stood." News of Judge Sterling's spectacular public removal spread through the courthouse like wildfire, and within hours, it dominated the local evening broadcasts. For years, Sterling had operated under the assumption that the people he crushed were too poor, too uneducated, or too exhausted to fight back. He had built a fortress of intimidation, but Chief Justice Evelyn Vance had dismantled it with a single notebook and a quietly unyielding presence. But Evelyn was not satisfied with merely removing one bad actor from the bench. She wanted to expose the entire ecosystem that had allowed him to thrive. The morning after the confrontation in Courtroom 302, she established an independent review panel to audit every verdict, contempt charge, and eviction Sterling had issued over the last decade. Sterling, meanwhile, retreated to his sprawling suburban home, desperately calling every political favor he thought he had banked over his 20-year career. He paced his mahogany-lined study, gripping his cell phone as he dialed state senators, wealthy developers, and police union bosses. "This is a political hit job," he barked into the receiver to a long-time ally in the city council. "She is trying to make a name for herself by tearing down a respected jurist. I need you to make a public statement condemning this overreach." But the responses he received were uniformly cold. The same men who used to invite him to exclusive golf outings and high-stakes poker games now suddenly had full voicemails. They had seen the news. They knew the Judicial Conduct Commission had seized his hard drives and sealed his archives. In the ruthless arithmetic of power, William Sterling had gone from a valuable asset to a radioactive liability overnight. Back at the Supreme Court building, the investigators were striking gold. Beneath Sterling's routine, cruelty lay a deeper, more sinister layer of corruption. By tracing the eviction orders, the commission discovered a disturbing pattern. Sterling consistently fast-tracked evictions for properties owned by 3 specific real estate LLCs. Whenever a tenant from one of these buildings appeared in his court, they were denied extensions, silenced during their defense, and hit with maximum penalties. When the financial forensic team peeled back the corporate layers of these shell companies, they found offshore accounts directly linked to Sterling's brother-in-law. It was not just systemic racism and classism driving his harsh rulings. It was a highly orchestrated, incredibly lucrative racketeering scheme. He was weaponizing the law to clear out low-income tenants so his associates could gentrify the neighborhoods and flip the properties for massive profits. Evelyn reviewed the financial reports in her office, her jaw setting into a tight, formidable line. Sterling wasn't just a bully operating under the cover of a black robe. He was a criminal who had turned the scales of justice into a cash register. The depth of Judge William Sterling's corruption was staggering. But Chief Justice Evelyn Vance had no intention of keeping it a quiet administrative matter. The district court had been weaponized against the most vulnerable citizens, and the cure for such a deep-rooted infection was absolute, unforgiving sunlight. Evelyn immediately forwarded the financial forensic reports to the state attorney general's office, bypassing the usual internal disciplinary committees. She formally recommended full criminal prosecution for racketeering, extortion, fraud, and abuse of public office. Sterling's desperate attempts to shield himself behind his former title crumbled instantly. The very law he had so arrogantly claimed to embody was now closing in on him with terrifying precision. 2 days later, just as the sun rose over Sterling's affluent suburban neighborhood, a fleet of unmarked state police vehicles quietly surrounded his sprawling, meticulously manicured estate. There was no grand courtroom to hide in, no elevated mahogany bench to protect him, and no loyal bailiff to intimidate his accusers. When the officers knocked heavily on his solid oak door, Sterling answered in a silk bathrobe, his face pale, aged, and sunken. The man who had callously ordered weeping mothers into the streets and threatened innocent people with jail time was now forced to turn around and place his trembling hands behind his back. As the cold steel of the handcuffs clicked securely around his wrists, the illusion of his supreme authority shattered forever. He was escorted out of his home in full view of his wealthy neighbors and the local news cameras that had caught wind of the raid. Sterling kept his head bowed, his face burning with shame, finally experiencing the exact public humiliation and utter powerlessness he had gleefully inflicted on countless others for decades. Back at the courthouse, the atmosphere had completely transformed. The heavy, suffocating cloud of fear that had dominated the halls for 10 years was entirely gone. Under Evelyn's direct, uncompromising supervision, the independent review panel began systematically dismantling Sterling's toxic legacy. Every single eviction order tied to his brother-in-law's corrupt shell companies was immediately reversed and flagged for financial compensation. The young, terrified mother who had stood weeping at the defense table just days earlier received a frantic, highly apologetic phone call from her landlord. By the end of the week, she was handed a court-ordered restitution check large enough to secure her family's housing for the next 2 years. Evelyn sat in her new chambers late that evening, reviewing the endless stack of vacated convictions and dismissed fines. The sheer volume of overturned cases represented hundreds of stolen lives finally restored. But she knew that arresting one corrupt judge was only the first step. The systemic silence that had allowed him to operate in the shadows needed to be eradicated for good. The cleanup of District Courtroom 302 was swift, but Chief Justice Evelyn Vance understood that the infection of corruption likely spread far beyond William Sterling's bench. She ordered a comprehensive statewide audit of all eviction and small claims courts, utilizing the newly uncovered racketeering scheme as a blueprint to catch other predatory officials. The message sent across the state was unequivocal. The era of unchecked judicial tyranny was officially over. The days of treating the law as an instrument of personal profit and racial prejudice had come to a hard, unforgiving end. A month later, William Sterling found himself back inside a courtroom, but this time, he was sitting at the defense table. He looked entirely diminished, stripped of his black robe, his heavy gavel, and his unearned arrogance. He was just another desperate defendant facing the overwhelming weight of the justice system. He faced a litany of federal charges for wire fraud, extortion, and conspiracy to commit racketeering. His high-priced defense attorney looked exhausted, constantly whispering to a man who still seemed incapable of grasping his new, powerless reality. Evelyn sat in the back row of the gallery, occupying the exact same worn oak pew she had sat in on her very first day. She wore her simple gray cardigan again, blending into the crowd of reporters, exonerated tenants, and curious legal clerks. She did not need to wear her Chief Justice robes today. True power did not require constant display. She watched with quiet, measured satisfaction as the state prosecutor meticulously laid out the mountain of irrefutable evidence against the disgraced judge. The prosecution's star witness was none other than Bailiff Harris. Recognizing that his own career and freedom were on the line, Harris had quickly accepted a plea deal. He took the stand and testified about the private conversations in Sterling's chambers, the back-channel communications with the real estate LLCs, and the deliberate targeting of unrepresented minorities. As Harris spoke, detailing years of systemic abuse and casual cruelty, Sterling buried his face in his trembling hands. The loyalty he had demanded through fear had evaporated the very second he lost his power to punish. Watching from the back, Evelyn took out her leather notebook one last time. She didn't write down evidence of a crime. She wrote down the blueprint for a new judicial oversight committee. The system was finally working exactly as it was meant to. The jury did not take long to deliberate. After only 4 hours of reviewing the mountain of undeniable evidence, they returned with a verdict that echoed through the silent courtroom, guilty on all counts. William Sterling, the man who had built a ruthless empire on intimidation and prejudice, stood visibly shaking as the presiding judge. One of Evelyn's carefully vetted and highly principled temporary appointees read the sentence: 15 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Furthermore, he was ordered to pay massive financial restitution to the vulnerable families he had illegally displaced. As the bailiffs moved in to handcuff him, Sterling did not look arrogant or defiant. He looked completely broken, finally crushed beneath the weight of the same absolute authority he had once wielded so carelessly against others. Evelyn Vance watched him being led away through the side doors. She felt no vindictiveness or triumph, only a profound sense of closure for the countless citizens whose lives had been derailed in this very room. She stood up from the worn oak pew, smoothing out her simple gray cardigan. As she walked down the center aisle, she noticed the subtle but unmistakable changes in Courtroom 302. The new bailiff stood respectfully at attention, not with a hand resting aggressively on his weapon, but with a calm, professional demeanor. The court clerks were speaking politely to a terrified young man facing a minor infraction, explaining his rights clearly and ensuring he understood the paperwork before him. The air in the room was no longer thick with fear and unspoken threats. It felt lighter, cleansed of the systemic cruelty that had poisoned it for a decade. Evelyn reached the heavy wooden double doors and pushed them open, stepping out into the bright, bustling marble hallway of the courthouse. She knew that removing one corrupt judge and his cronies was not the end of the war. There were still deeply ingrained biases to uproot and broken systems to repair across the state. But as she looked at the diverse crowd of citizens navigating the halls, people who could now walk into a courtroom, knowing the law was a shield for them, not a weapon against them. She knew the foundation had been permanently shifted. Justice was no longer an exclusive privilege for the wealthy and connected. Evelyn walked out of the courthouse and into the morning sun, her leather notebook tucked safely under her arm. She had walked in as a nameless, powerless woman, and she was leaving as the architect of a new era. The gavel had finally been returned to the people, and the silence of complicity had been broken forever.